had the SIM card for Portugal. We'd divided countries, and he'd locked his phone, and I didn't know what the passcode was because I'd never thought that I would have to use it or he would be there to ask, you know.
From Mamma Mia, deep inside my cupboard at home, I'm Mia Friedman, and welcome to No Filter. I hope you're hanging in there. I hope everyone's hanging in there as best we possibly can. The good news is that podcasts comply with all the social distancing requirements, so having me in your ears at any time of the day or night is perfectly safe. And like all podcasts really, it's an effective way, I think, to feel connected in these incredibly uncertain and, look, let's be honest, totally weird and anxious times. We are going to be making a few changes to No Filter in response to this new world we're all living in, and all of them are good. Don't worry. We're going to be bringing you, first of all, some extra mini episodes in a new series that we have called How Are You Doing?, where I'm going to call up people I know via Skype, people that you know, and just checking in. And of course, we're also going to be continuing to bring you your regular No Filters, stories that have nothing to do with Corona and that just serve as a way to transport yourself out of your head and hopefully distract you with a compelling, engaging, and sometimes funny conversation. Even in tragic stories, there's a lot to laugh about. And that brings me to the second part of this week's No Filter, which I'm going to bring you today, my interview with Susan Francis and her story. In the last episode, I mentioned that some stories are so incredible that you couldn't make them up, and I introduced you to a woman whose life has been just like that. Her name, if you haven't heard that first episode earlier this week, her name's Susan Francis, and she has such an epic story that we had to space it over 2 parts. So just scroll back in your feed and listen to that one first. Today is part 2. Susan's adoption story was really dramatic. Her adoptive parents were beautiful, loving people, but as they grew older and her dad became sick, he encouraged her to find her biological parents. And not all adoption reunion stories end with a happily ever after, sadly. Susan did end up finding her biological mother, who went on to reject her in the most cruel and surprising way. In the middle of all that heartbreak, some good news. Along came Wayne. Tall, handsome Wayne. And he stole Susan's heart, really. Her first marriage had ended long ago. She'd been a single mother to her son, Jono, for almost 20 years, and all she ever wanted was to find love. So when she and Wayne met, when Susan was in her 50s, it really was a dream come true for her. They sold everything up and embarked on this grand adventure. They decided to move overseas. But Susan could not predict the tragedy that was about to cut their late-in-life love story short, and the really unbelievable twist that came after it. Here is where we pick up Susan's story. You and Wayne decided to move to Spain, to Granada. How long had you been together? And that's a big move to make.
It's a massive move. He just said, we were just sitting there one afternoon on the couch, how would you like to go overseas for a year? And I didn't even have to think. It was immediate, you know. And this just added to my love of him, that he wanted to do this too. And he very much wanted us to go somewhere where the language was more difficult, where the culture was very different, where we would just have to rely on each other and have this great adventure. And who wouldn't want that?
Did you feel like he was running away from something, or he was running towards something?
It's a really good... I never felt he was running away from something. I never felt that. No, I did. I felt like he was running towards something. I felt like he was, because he would say things like, this is going to be the best year of our life, or the next 10 years of our life are going to be the best, because he actually felt older than I felt. He would talk about life not being very long. It was almost like he had a premonition. It's, we don't have very long to live. We have to take it now. Yeah, very much, very much. That was very much. And I'd always felt that too, but not to the same extent that he did. And I could see he really wanted to do it, and obviously I really wanted to do it. So I never thought that he was running away. I just thought, here's a man who's mastered life so well that he can say to me, let's go and do this. And I trusted him that we would be fine, and we sold everything to finance it. We sold the house, we sold my car, we sold the furniture, we sold everything, because you had to have a certain amount of money in the bank for Spain to give you that kind of visa.
People talk a lot, and there's a lot written about young love. What's different about love in your 50s?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that you really know yourself so much better. I think you know what you want. I think, and what you don't want. I think there is that, even though I maybe not have felt it as much as Wayne, there is that idea that you haven't got that much life left. So it's like an embrace of everything that's wonderful and everything that's possible and everything that's beautiful just at the other end of your life. And it makes it more profound and more joyous and more important and significant. I remember when I first got married when I was very young, 22, thinking, I honestly thought this is terrible. If it doesn't work out, I'll get a divorce. You don't think that at 52. You know, you're going to make this. You're going to make this good and you're going to make this great. And I suppose because you know yourself well and because you know what you want, you're not going to get tangled up in somebody who's only kind of half worth it.
They've got to be very additive to your life.
Yes, absolutely.
You write a lot in your book about you being two halves of a whole. Tell me a little bit about that.
So I remember at university I read this theory, Aristotle's theory of love, and it had always lodged in my brain. It had been one of those theories that I'd had in the back of my head, that whether it's two men, two women, or a man and a woman, love occurs because originally we are hermaphrodites with two heads, 4 arms, 4 legs, but we're facing back to back, and we travel around the world happily, joyfully, cartwheeling around the world with such a glorious time. And then because we're so happy and so in love, this is the way the myth goes, the gods get really annoyed because you can't be that happy, and so they cut you in half. And so for the rest of your life, you're wandering around the world trying to find that other half to make you whole again and to make you happy. That's the version of the story I remember. And Wayne would say, I found my other half. That's what he would always say. And I, of course, would think back to that idea that I'd had at uni and think, so this is what it means. This is what it's really like.
Did you feel that way too?
Yeah, I really did. I felt he was different to me because he was bigger. He was so big. He was so big. And
how big was he?
I'm going to say 6'4", with massive, great big shoulders. And because he'd worked in the mines from the early 70s, you know, they used to have to do it with the picks and so you know, and I would always fit under his shoulder, and he was always steering me here and there, which sounds terrible, but I just felt like I was being looked after and like I didn't have to worry anymore. And, you know, I'd raised my son as a single mother, and work was hard, and it was just such a relief to feel that I had a man who I could rely on and who I could trust.
How long did you get to spend together in Spain?
Only 6 months. So
what was that time like?
Oh, it's glorious. It was, if you can imagine, like everything coming true. So we arrived in January and it was snowing in southern Spain. And you know, the flat was tiny, but we were beneath the Alhambra, and so we had the most glorious view of Granada. And, you know, we could stand on that veranda. It was like a square, and we could look down and all the little houses with all the lights and the snow. And, you know, he had his arm around me, and it was just like everything had come true. And we would go up and down because it was incredibly hilly, up and down to go to Spanish classes, and we travelled and we'd sit in the square and we'd drink and we'd eat tapas, and we met such interesting people. We met some Russian Buddhists, and we met people from India and, from all around the world. It felt like a real melting pot, and it was a beautiful city, and we didn't have to work. Like, it was perfect.
How long had you planned to stay?
So we'd planned to stay for 12 months with an option to stay longer if we could afford it. And because Wayne's superannuation he was almost 60. And so we thought, if we really want to stay longer, we'll take some of his superannuation money and keep on. And he really wanted to go to Portugal, which I really didn't get. It's right next door to Spain. Why don't we go to Estonia, or why don't we go to Russia? But he really wanted to see Portugal. So we'd gone to Eastern Europe, and that was beautiful. And so we came back, and then some things happened which made me feel a little bit unsafe, with an experience on the street with someone who had a knife. And Wayne kind of physically protected me. And after that, we decided we'd go to Portugal. And he was really looking forward to it. And I couldn't understand why he was looking, because Spain is quite similar to Portugal. But he said, I want to see it because it's similar, but it's not. The language is similar, but it's not. The food is similar, but it's not. Let's go and see Portugal. Okay, let's go and see Portugal. I said, let's go and see Portugal. And we set off in May, and he hired a car, and we went up to southern France, and then across the top of Spain, and then down into Portugal. And it was just before his 60th birthday. And we went to Porto, which is the most amazing city ever. And then we landed in Lisbon. And that was probably 3 or 4 days before his birthday. Yeah, that was in June.
And what happened on that very difficult day?
So I was writing, it was morning, and we were in the flat, and we were in the port area, and I could hear the ships and the seagulls, and he was not a morning person. He really liked to sleep in, but I always liked to get up and have coffee. And I was tapping away on the laptop, and I heard this noise, and it was such a strange noise. And so Wayne was not frightened of anything, ever. I'd never seen him frightened of anything. But the noise was definitely fear. And I remember jumping up and racing into the bedroom, and he was up on one hand, and his face was all purple, and I could see that he couldn't breathe. And I remember racing over and hitting him on the back, and then realising, what on earth are you doing? Like, this is just crazy. He's dying. I could see he was dying. And at school we'd been taught, and I still believe this is the right thing, if you're on your own, you race and you phone for an ambulance. And I still go backwards and forwards, whether I should have stayed or whether I should have raced for the ambulance. But I raced for the ambulance, and my phone wasn't working because the SIM card was not for Portugal. His phone was the phone that had the SIM card for Portugal. We'd divided countries, and he'd locked his phone, and I didn't know what the passcode was, because I'd never thought that I would have to use it, or he would be there to ask, And then for some reason I started looking at the laptop and trying to find the number, because in my panic, the number was actually on the back of the door, but I just didn't think to look.
No.
So I've got the laptop going, and I've got my phone charging, even though I know my phone isn't going to work. I can't get his phone to work. All the time he's in the room next to me. Eventually my phone charged and I did get through, but not to Portugal because I got through to somebody in London and they just said, look, we don't know what the number is. Like I just didn't know what to do. So I raced across the hallway, banging on the door, and nobody answered because it wasn't a motel, it was actually apartments. So then I raced down the corridor and I'm like half dressed, raced backwards and forwards down that corridor trying to decide what I'm going to do in absolute panic. Finally the woman opens the door, but we can't understand each other. And I'm like trying to show that my husband, I remember saying, mi marida, in my terrible Spanish accent, trying to say my husband is morte, he's dying or he's dead. But she couldn't understand me. And then her daughter came out and they're all half dressed as well. And she kind of understood a little bit and she said she'd go and use a fixed phone downstairs, which I didn't even know was there. She came back and in between time I'd tried to convince the woman to come in with me into the bedroom because I thought I can try and revive Wayne and she can try on her phone to get the ambulance because now there's two of us. But she wouldn't come in. She just refused to come in. She told me her phone didn't work, told me. I went in and Wayne had collapsed on the bed and I'm checking for a pulse and I couldn't find a pulse. I didn't know whether I just couldn't find it or whether he'd really died. I started trying to do mouth to mouth, but his mouth was really slack and my mouth is small and he had a really large mouth. So I just couldn't get my mouth to, physically to fit over his mouth.
I can't imagine how you must have been feeling.
And then the girl came back and said she got the phone and I now realise, because I've investigated what it was I was doing and how I was feeling, it was flight or fight response. I felt I couldn't fight there. I felt that I needed an ambulance. So I raced down all the stairs, all the way down to the bottom, scoped out some stranger, went through my terrible Spanish accent again to a Portuguese man. He eventually understood what I was trying to say. We eventually figured out what street it was. He eventually rang the ambulance. I don't know how longer this is, maybe 20 minutes since Wayne, I don't know, 30 minutes. Then I raced back upstairs. He says, half Portuguese, half Spanish, he will hold the door open. I raced back upstairs and Wayne's dead on the bed, I can tell. And I didn't even think to do anything else. I just sat. Next to him, holding his hand.
Oh, Susan, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. It's okay.
I'm so sorry to make you relive that and talk about it.
I haven't told it for a while.
What did you do then? Did you come home? You must have just wanted to be with him.
It was such a flurry of activity. All of a sudden, the ambulance turned up. 2 ambulances turned up. And I'm on the bed holding his hand. And the bedroom was tiny. And they couldn't lift him because he was so heavy. So I had to help lift him off the bed and put him on the cement floor. And they had me start to do CPR. So I was sitting on his chest and they were putting things down his throat. But I didn't want him to wake up at that moment because I knew too much time had gone by. I couldn't imagine if he'd woken up and had been not the person he used to be. I wasn't sure how he would cope with that. I wasn't sure how I would cope with that. But I just remember sitting on him and doing this CPR over and over and over again. But nothing worked. They couldn't revive him and they tried for a very long time. Police turned up, lots of police and doctors, and just the whole apartment was just filled with all these people in uniform and people who were talking to it. And they were talking, and I didn't understand what they were saying. And then one of the policemen said to ring somebody, and somehow I got through to Jono, and I don't know how I got through to Jono. I can't remember how I got through to Jono. Something to do with Facebook and being able to talk through Facebook or something, not using my actual phone but using it. And he's in Sydney, and I'm like, and he just could not believe what I was saying to him. I couldn't believe what I was saying to him. And his beautiful girlfriend, Jamie, at the time, said we need to ring the consulate, which they did. Yeah, and they turned up as well. And they were the ones, the lovely Australian woman from the consulate in Portugal. She's the one who liaised with the police. I had to write a statement.
Because there's a lot of paperwork.
Amazing.
When anyone dies, but when someone dies overseas, my understanding is that it's a lot.
And we were just, if there's one thing I should say to people, if you do something like us, take your paperwork no matter where you go, because if I'd not been able to prove that we were married, I would not have been accepted as next of kin, and none of the things that happened could have happened.
You couldn't have taken any of the decisions or made the arrangements.
I couldn't. They would have had to have flown his mother over, or so because we'd made the decision to bring the marriage certificate and everything with us, I could prove that he was my husband.
I can't imagine how you must have been feeling. You got yourself back to Australia without him. It's not the way you expected that time to come to an end in Spain.
No, not in a million years. I think I was in shock because it took ages for me to get home. Jono had to come home earlier because he had to come back to work. And there were things
he flew over to be with you.
He flew over to be with me. He was with me with the cremation and all of that. He drove me back to Grenada because by then it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks after we should have been back in Grenada by then. He drove the car back.
Why did you decide to have him cremated there?
It's a really good question. I just don't think I could have handled getting the body back, and it would have just been so much more than what we did. By having him cremated, I don't know, he was on the back seat of the car as we were driving back to Grenada. I had him in my lap coming back on the plane. I just can't if it was so hard, I can't imagine what it would have been like with the body as well. Plus, I didn't have any money left. We'd been living on my money, and my money was almost, both of our money, but for the last month, mainly my money, and that was almost finished. And we were about to get Wayne's superannuation because we'd been spending like there was no tomorrow.
It's ironic.
Yeah, very ironic. I thought, how much is this going to cost? I don't have the money. And all the bank accounts had been frozen the minute he died. So money all of a sudden, whereas once it had not been a problem because I'd had a good income as a teacher.
And something that's so mundane as money, when you are looking at these life-changing, gut-wrenching decisions like how do I bring my dead husband home, and suddenly money factors into the equation. It's really expensive to transport a body.
Yeah, and I'd heard figures like $20,000.
Wow.
But the consulate lady and the lady that she contracted to do the funeral, the service, the cremation, both of them said to me, this is a better option than trying to do a body. And also all the furniture and all our luggage and everything was back in Grenada, and I had to get the car back there. So how could I have transported, logically it wasn't going to work.
Had you known that Wayne had been married before?
No. And I don't think he'd been married. I think it was a common marriage or
de facto.
De facto, thank you. No, he told me that he'd never been married.
And when did you start finding out things about Wayne that you didn't know?
Didn't know. So this is if anything, I find this more difficult to speak about than his death, but it's equally important. So 2 days after Wayne died, when I was in Portugal and still in shock, and Jono had arrived, I received this phone call from this guy who was obviously drunk, and he claimed to be a relative of Wayne's, but I'd never met him. I'd heard of him, but I'd never met him. And Wayne had not spoken positively about this guy. So when he rang, straight away I was kind of on the alert, and I could hear him pouring the liquor into the glass every so often, and his voice was slurring, and he started saying really awful things about Wayne. So this was my first intimation that something was not right. He started saying things like, no wonder he was always a miner working underground. He was too scared to put his head up. I can't believe the old goat got married. He always said he'd never get married. And back then I was very thin, and he said, I've looked at your picture on Facebook. You're a slip of a thing. Weren't you afraid of being with him? Hasn't he ever told you what really happened? Why would you have married him? And 2 days after Wayne's death, I immediately went into defence mode. And I felt like he was casting aspersions on whether or not our love was real. That's what it sounded like to me. So I'm immediately, no, we loved each other. He was the greatest man in the world. And responses to that were, what? I can't believe you're saying that. So he never really told me what he was talking about, but I understood that it wasn't good. And then I just got swallowed up in everything else, in getting home, in starting my life again, in grieving. Like, I grieved so hard. And so that conversation was put to the back. And I suppose somewhere in my mind I knew I'm going to put that conversation back there, but when I'm ready I'll bring that out again and re-examine that and try and figure out what that was all about. And then I found out I had herpes, which at 50, so at that stage I was 55.
That's unexpected.
Very unexpected. I hadn't slept with anyone else.
That's a twist in the story that we didn't see coming.
No, and I didn't see it coming either. When she said you've got herpes, I just remember thinking, what?
Have I not suffered enough?
Yeah, that was one of the thoughts that went through my head, but also the irony, because she assured me it had to be Wayne because, you know, the history that we'd had, how long previous since I'd slept with someone, etc., 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 that men don't get it often as hard as women do. Their symptoms don't appear, that possibly he had it when he was very young and hadn't had anything
didn't realise
since.
that.
Yeah, didn't realise, blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, my husband's died and I've got herpes from him. I've got herpes from my dead husband.
Should have been the name of your book, Susan.
Herpes from my
Catchy
dead
title. Would have sold its socks off. Get it printed on some T-shirt.
Like, what? Like, I just could not believe it. I could not believe it. And my herpes is the kind that comes back. And, you know, you can get tablets to keep it away, but I don't want to be on any tablets. So when it arrives and it sticks its little face up, hi, welcome home.
Yeah.
I'll deal with you. Yep, I'll deal with you for a week and then you can go away again. So that irony also made me begin to question
how truthful he'd been with you about things.
That's exactly right. I mean, there's every possibility he did not know, but equally he might have known. And then 2017, things were kind of beginning to get back on track. I always remember when I was grieving, somebody somebody said to me, what is it that you would most want? And one of the things I really wanted was to know when the grief lessens. How long have I got to suffer this, you know?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah. But of course nobody knows the answer because for everybody it's different. But maybe 2.5 years, 2 years, things were not as bad as what they'd been. And his mother came to visit, and it was a nice visit. His mother and I get on very well. And I just, for some reason, just decided I'd ask. And she just collapsed and said, oh, Susie, when Wayne was 22 and living in New Guinea, he was charged with the murder of a young woman. And she was crying, and I didn't want to press her too hard because she was obviously very distressed. He spent 3.5 years in jail for it. And that was about it, I think, from what I best remember, because I didn't want to question her. I didn't want to make it worse. And it was one of those things, like I was just in shock. And I remember thinking, I don't want the shock to show on my face because I don't want to upset her anymore. So I'm kind of like, that's okay, that's okay. All the time in my head, it's just like it was just unbelievable. And she went in to have a rest, and I got in the car and drove to Waratah. And I remember sitting in the car, and the car next to me was going backwards. And it wasn't that. It was me going backwards because I hadn't put the handbrake on. I hadn't done what I just...
What a metaphor.
Yeah.
You write about that beautifully.
So, like, I don't even know how to explain to you how shocking that was. In some ways, I think it's more shocking than Wayne died.
Did it feel like he died again?
I don't think he died again, but I think this other part of him that I didn't know, perhaps, or part of me died, maybe. It was definitely something that took me a very long time to process. And I still think about it all the time. And I still, I think, manage the way I feel about it by having him. Yeah, I do still. I thought maybe as time went on I would manage it better, but there's half of me remembers Wayne and how wonderful he was with me and how much he loved me and looked after me and how much he gave me and how much I loved him. And the other half of me thinks of this young wild man in New Guinea and what happened that night. And the only way I can manage is to keep it separate and to think that I knew one person, but there'd also been this other person. I don't love Wayne any less. In some ways, I feel like I almost love him more.
Why is that?
I know, it's a very strange thing. So I really had to know. I had to know whether or not he'd murdered somebody, because Jesus, how could I have loved somebody who'd murdered somebody, a woman, a young woman?
It was his partner at the time.
It was his partner. And so I've eventually, after much investigation, there's a tiny little bit of the internet that holds the appeal cases, not for New Guinea, but for the Pacific Islands. It's a very obscure website. And there is the appeal case where the charge was reduced from murder to manslaughter.
And that described what happened that night.
And I read that, and there was still some questions I felt within that. And I had my brother look at it because he'd been a former police prosecutor, and I said to him, this appeal case, it feels to me that there are questions on both sides. It feels to me like there are questions both on whether he's guilty and whether he's not guilty. It doesn't seem 100% clear to me what really happened, whether it was an accident or whether it was on purpose. Although it was reduced to manslaughter and he did do 3.5 years in jail. So I needed to know for myself, because the difference, when you start looking at violence and when you start dissecting levels of violence, the difference between a man that I loved intentionally killing someone and the man that I loved accidentally killing someone.
For those who don't understand, without wanting you to relive that, there was an altercation between him and his partner. He pushed her away. He alleges he pushed her away, and she then fell down some stairs and died. And the question of murder or manslaughter was, did he mean to push her over the edge of this balcony, or was that an accident he just pushed her away from him? And there are only two people who will ever know the answer to that, and neither of them are alive to tell that story.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So you had to come to terms with it in your own mind.
So the appeal case was not enough for me. So I went to New Guinea and experienced my own episode of violence over there, because the country is in enormous turmoil, especially for women.
It's a terrible country for women.
And I had armed guards, and still we were held up on the road. And I spoke to his brother, and his brother was like, it was really like just seeing Wayne, but a more bitten Wayne, because he'd spent all his life in New Guinea without health care or with it. So he told me the story of the night, and his story is that Wayne shoved her off him and she fell over the banister, and Caroline, her name is, by the way, Caroline fell over the banister and hit the posts and then landed to the bottom. And that Wayne did not defend himself. He just kept saying, yes, I did it. It doesn't matter how I did it. And he went to jail. But his brother's account, also my knowledge of Wayne, the whole idea of him being so big and never being aware of his strength, I do believe it's an accident. I mean, I may be wrong. I don't know, because as you said, both he and Caroline are dead. But I believe that it was an accident.
How do you have any faith in the world and in facts and in what you see being real when there have been so many sort of lies and disappointments and mysteries and things below the surface that you didn't know, both in your own life and then in your marriage to Wayne?
So I now believe very much in myself, and I know that if something doesn't ring true, I can hear it. I can hear instinctively that this is not right, or I need to know more about this, and I will go to the ends of the earth to discover. New Guinea really was a very difficult place to travel to, but I won't live with not knowing. If it's important to me and it's important to who I am and it's important to the people I love, then the only way I can have trust and faith in what's going on is by finding out for myself.
And have you made peace with your biological parents being such devastating disappointments? Okay, assholes.
So my father's passed away. He actually passed away last year or the year before.
How did you even know how to feel about that?
I don't really feel anything. I suppose what I learnt was they really weren't as important as what I thought they were. My mother and father, who adopted me, were the important ones. And my son and my best friend and my brother and Wayne, all the people that I loved and who always had my back and always supported me, they're the people who make me who I am.
Biology doesn't make you a parent.
It really does not. It really does not. And, somewhere I know that I imagine that my birth mother is still alive. And I often wonder about how I feel, you know, if she reads the book or she hears me, she would no doubt recognise the story.
Do you know if she went on to have children that she kept?
She did. 2 daughters, ironically enough.
Have you ever? Are they both called Susan?
4 Susans.
Have you had contact with them?
No.
It's kind of like, where does it end? Because it's like there's them, then they've probably got children, and then it's like there's this whole other life.
Yeah, a whole other realm.
Yeah, this whole other realm that lives in the world that you don't have contact with. Did you just decide, I can't go through another rejection and disappointment?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
That doorstep, that was enough. I received the information, even though it was false. It did lead me on to what I needed to know. So I found the story. All I ever wanted was the story.
Yeah, but you've come to understand, like you've told yourself a story about Wayne, like you've made sense of it in your mind about what happened in his past and why he didn't tell you. Can you do the same for your mother?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. I feel so much more sympathy for her than what I did when I started the journey. And this is something I write about and something I've learned as I've gone through this journey. People tell lies to protect the people they love. So my mother told lies to protect herself, her husband, and then her children. I'm outside of that square. I have to be outside of that square for her survival and for her life. And so learning about Wayne and that Wayne had lied to me because he was so afraid, so vulnerable, that I wouldn't love him if I knew what had happened. That's exactly what she did, you know.
I suppose the last question I wanted to ask you is, are you okay? I don't just mean today, but like, are you okay?
It's hard. I still wrestle. I don't think I'll ever really be able to marry those 2 versions of Wayne together. But I was loved. I know that for sure. And that's all I ever really wanted. So, yeah, my life is not perfect and I struggle every day like so many people do, but I'm still here.
You are still here, and I'm so glad you're still here because you've written the most extraordinary book. Thank you for writing it, and thank you for your generosity in sharing those incredibly tough moments and reliving them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now we need a drink.
A wine.
That's right. Isn't Susan incredible? She's a beautiful storyteller, as you've heard, and she's an even more spectacular writer. So get your hands on a physical or digital copy of her book, The Love That Remains. And if you want to know what Susan looks like, I'm always curious after hearing someone's voice or reading their book to know what they look like. I've posted a little clip of her and I that we recorded straight after this interview. Her face is still a little bit teary, but she's just got such a beautiful energy. It's in my Instagram feed, so you can see that clip if you go and look for me on Instagram. I'm just at Mia Friedman. We are going to keep bringing you No Filter while we're social distancing, of course, and we're also bringing you Mamma Mia Out Loud 3 times a week now, Monday, Wednesday and Friday, and all of our podcasts. In particular, if you want to stay across Corona news, The Quickie drops every morning at 6 a.m. and is a great way to get yourself across what you need to know in just 15 minutes and then try to get on with your day. Get in touch with us because we want to know how you're feeling and what you want to listen to while you're at home. You can email us anytime at podcast@mamamia.com.au. Take care, really, and lots of love.